Welcome to the Red Sneaker Podcast, your guide to success in the worlds of writing and publishing. Now, here's your host, best-selling author and founder of the Red Sneaker Writers Center, William Bernhardt.
Hello, Red Sneaker Writers. This is episode 19, going out on May 20th, 2019. This podcast is for Red Sneaker Writers, people who are serious about having a writing career and want some practical knowledge to help them do it. On this podcast, my special guest interview is with Jeff Yamaguchi. He's the marketing director at Blackstone Audio, one of the oldest and most venerated companies. They were way back before digitalization. They were putting out books on tape. They've continued to stay in that game now that audiobooks are taking off. Plus, they've expanded into print. Jeff will comment on print and audio and also has some very useful advice for authors, marketing tips, some useful, practical, step-by-step approaches to effective author marketing. But first, the news. In a previous podcast, I talked about the young adult fantasy novel by Emily Onezal, which was supposed to come out in June, but she voluntarily agreed to cancel it, to pull the book from publication after a social media Twitter storm erupted. Some people got a hold of early copies of the novel and felt that it was racist, or at the very least racially insensitive, which was probably a big shock to the mixed-race author. She became very upset and, as I said, never mind, I don't want the book to be published. Well, she's come back, and she's decided that maybe she'd like to see her first novel in print after all. The critics weren't right, she says, but she made some revisions just the same, probably for the very purpose of downplaying some of the people's objections. So now the book is going to come out in November from the Delacorte Press. This reminds me of possibly the importance of having beta readers for your book, something I wrote about in my last blog post. You can read those on my website, williambernhardt.com. But sometimes when you have friends, maybe not close friends, but people who aren't hostile are likely to start a Twitter storm at any rate. And if you get some advanced feedback, you can be made aware of some of the objections people might have to plot lines or characters. It's happened to me, and that's what I write about in the blog, and I'm grateful to have that kind of input up front. I'm glad that Miss Zhao has decided to go ahead and release her book. Of course, I spend so much time with, promising and incipient writers that I hate to see anybody's career cut short. Mind you, I haven't read the book. I have no idea if any of the allegations are correct or not. I feel strongly that she didn't intend any racist content to be in her book, and having people literally end books or end writers' career before they've even launched smacks so much of prior restraint that it sort of offends the First Amendment lawyer in me. If you've got an objection, okay, you can make that, but maybe not in such a dramatic way that people feel like they've got to cancel the book. This is not the only instance of it. You may have seen another story in the past couple weeks involving an author named Natasha Tynes. She published something, again on Twitter, a photograph she took of a black woman, heavyset, who was eating on a Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority train, which apparently violates some kind of rule. And people thought that the post was sort of body-shaming the woman and took a very negative reaction to it. Again, another Twitter storm to such intensity that the distributor for the book, Rare Bird, dropped the project. And at that point, the publisher, California Coldblood, may have felt they had little choice. And so they canceled her book debut novel, which was called They Called Me Wyatt. Well, I haven't seen this post any more than I've read Ms. Zhao's book, and I can't comment on whether, it was inappropriate or not. I suspect she was just trying to post something on Twitter. Her bio on Twitter says that she is herself Jordanian American. So it's hard to imagine she's completely racially insensitive. She probably did not realize what she was getting into, and now what's happened? Her book's been canceled. Similarly, in yet another story, a publisher not only canceled and pulled a novel, but pulped all copies 1 week after it was published because people online condemned the book, saying that it had Islamophobic themes and content. Well, do you see a trend developing here? Because I certainly do. Again, I am all in favor of inclusion, and I think we should be racially sensitive. But on the other hand, writers, protect yourself. We live in an age of hypersensitivity, Twitter storms, political correctness, and it is best just not to say anything that could be possibly controversial in this way. I mean, I always think books should have an edge to them. Kafka said, writing a book's like throwing a brick through a window. It should wake people up, but not perhaps offend them. And as you can see, mistakes like this are damaging to people's career. You know, imagine being so excited your first book is about to come out, and then something like this happens, and all at once it's over. Even if it's not over, it's got this ugly tarnish to it that spoils the whole thing. Red Sneaker writers, don't let this happen to you. Be careful. Be racially sensitive. Think about the reactions others may have to what you write, not only in your books, but on social media. And whenever possible, get some good beta readers to look at your work before it goes out. The second news item I want to talk about has to do with book wholesalers, which is typically how independent booksellers get their books. They either order direct from the publisher or they use a wholesaler, which in the past has been either Ingram or Baker & Taylor. Well, no longer. Baker & Taylor has announced that it's not serving the wholesale book distributor market to retailers anymore, not serving as a distributor to retailers, meaning independent bookstores primarily. You know, they'll still work with libraries, but this is a bad break for independent bookstores who typically have relied on wholesalers to get a little bit of margin. That is, a little bit of price break. As I said, you can always order direct from the publisher, but you can often get a little bit of a break by going to a wholesaler. Well, those options have narrowed, which means that to some extent, Ingram has something that looks a lot like a monopoly. And moreover, independent booksellers, which have a tough row to hoe to begin with, well, it just got a little bit tougher. They've got fewer options, which might make it that much more difficult for independent bookstores to survive. I've been very pleased by some of the statistics in the past year or so that indicate that there are more independent bookstores and they're doing a little bit better financially. It's small margins to be sure, but it's an optimistic trend, or one I can be optimistic about, and this looks like it's going to be a bad break for them. One more news story, and that has to do with the Self-E program for distributing independent books to libraries. That's capital SELF small e. Now, this is not actually a new program. It actually launched in 2015, and it was somewhat controversial. Well, it was a lot controversial when it first launched. This was a partnership between Library Journal and BiblioBoard, and the point was to make ebooks available to libraries nationwide. Any author can submit their work for inclusion in Self-E at no cost. Library Journal then curates its list, basically deciding which books are going to go into the national collection and which ones will not. But even books that are not selected are still accessible to libraries through their individual state collections. Why was this controversial? Sounds like a great deal, you may be thinking. Well, here's the problem. Self-E didn't pay indie authors for library usage. Their position was that this is more of a marketing and discovery service. The idea is to help authors build an audience, generate demand, and then maybe they can earn something on other titles. Well, that's changing a little bit, and that's a positive trend. I mean, it's still mostly a place where independent authors aren't going to make much money, but there are two possible funds generating options now. The first is the Indie Author Project contests. The point of these contests is to identify the best indie published fiction by state, and the winners get money, cash prizes, and they get some promotion in Library Journal, and their books are made available to public libraries. So that's one way of generating a little bit of cash through this program. They've also partnered with Ingram Spark to sell, market, and promote the winners of these contests. And finally, Selfie is also partnering with Overdrive. As you may be aware, Overdrive is the primary ebook distributor for libraries. And they're going to partner to pay not just for the books that win these contests, but for any book that's curated, that is selected by Library Journal for a Selfie's national collection, or perhaps other partners in the future. Currently, according to someone at the Selfie program, about 8% of all submitted titles pass the first round of curation, which actually is higher than I might have expected it to be. So, and Overdrive, of course, pays royalties. So that's another way that you might possibly generate some income from your books. All of these are positive trends, but Red Sneaker writers, I'm also going to point out that you have other ways of getting into Overdrive. For one thing, you can initiate your own Overdrive account. It may not be worth your while depending on how many titles you have, but you can do it. You can also partner with companies I've mentioned in the past, Draft to Digital for ebooks and now print books, or Find Away Voices for audiobooks. Now, I'm not getting any promotional consideration for these from these companies. I'm not, getting paid to mention them. I'm just telling you these are effective ways that I've used in the past that do, in fact, get your books in front of, get them into Overdrive so that they can be ordered by libraries. Don't feel embarrassed about not wanting to give your books away for free. I suspect that in truth, very few of you started writing because you thought this was how you were going to get rich. You got into it because you love books and you love stories and you had something to say and you wanted to share it. Nonetheless, I am a firm advocate for authors, and authors have a right to be compensated for this work. There's too much stuff going on right now, including online piracy. People who seem to have the attitude that art should be free or artists shouldn't be compensated. Well, guess what? Writers have bills to pay just like everybody else. You worked hard to write that story, novel, nonfiction book, whatever it is. You deserve to be fairly compensated. So don't be embarrassed ever about taking advantage of these programs and others I've mentioned in this podcast to make sure that you are treated fairly. My interview is with Jeffrey Yamaguchi. He is the marketing director at Blackstone Audio, which, as I mentioned, also handles print books, and he has spent a lot of time working with authors, helping them to develop marketing platforms. What I really like about what Jeff has to say is that it is so practical. Even people who don't want to spend the rest of their lives on social media can take his advice, build it step by step, and come up with something that works for you. Here's what he had to say. Jeff, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, I always ask everybody the same first question. What piece of advice would you offer somebody who wants to write?
For someone who wants to write, I have to take this advice myself. I have to remind myself of it, is you got to write. You have to find different vehicles to write. It's not necessarily always about the book project you're working on. You just always have to be writing and creating. And that will feed the energy and actually lead to the larger project, which very well could be like a finished novel or a finished nonfiction book.
Terrific. You are the Senior Director of Marketing at Blackstone. So, in a nutshell, what does that entail?
Well, it's really fun at Blackstone right now. Blackstone is a 30-year-old company, audiobook publisher. They're a pioneer in audiobooks, back when it was books on tape. And then the last